Why does every family member who inherits our uncle's pocket watch die in an accident at the exact time shown on the frozen hands? The coroner pulled back the sheet covering my cousin Daniel's body, and I forced myself to look at his face. His eyes were open, frozen in what looked like surprise, a thin line of dried blood trailing from his nose. The accident report said he'd fallen down his apartment stairs at 3:17 a.m., broke his neck on impact, died instantly. But what made my hands start trembling as I stood in that sterile viewing room was the silver pocket watch they'd found in his hand, still clutched tight even in death. The hands were frozen at 3:17. The same watch Uncle Raymond had left Daniel in his will 6 weeks earlier. The same watch that had been passed to 3 other family members over the past 8 years. All of them dead within 2 months of receiving it. All of them dying in accidents at the exact time shown on those frozen hands. I'd been working as an insurance claims adjuster for 11 years, long enough to develop instincts about patterns and coincidences that weren't really coincidences. My job involved investigating suspicious deaths, reviewing accident reports, finding the details that didn't add up. I'd seen enough fraud attempts and staged incidents to know when something felt wrong. Standing in that morgue, looking at Daniel's body and that damned watch, every alarm in my head was screaming, but the logical part of my brain kept pushing back. Accidents happen. People die. Grief makes us see patterns where none exist. I wanted to believe that. I needed to believe that, because accepting the alternative meant accepting that someone in my family had killed 4 people and was probably planning to kill more. Uncle Raymond had died 8 years ago in a car accident on Interstate 85, his vintage Cadillac swerving off the road into a concrete barrier at 3:17 p.m. on a clear afternoon. He'd been 63, a retired jeweler who'd never married, no kids, his estate divided among various nieces and nephews, according to a will he'd updated 6 months before his death. The pocket watch had been his prized possession, a 1920s Hamilton Railroad watch that had belonged to his grandfather. Family legend said the watch had stopped working the moment Raymond's grandfather died in 1952, the hands frozen forever at 3:17. Raymond had kept it as a memento, carried it everywhere despite it being non-functional, claimed it reminded him that time was precious. His will specified the watch should be passed to family members as they reached certain milestones, marriages, graduations, major birthdays, cycling through the family line according to a predetermined order he'd established. The first recipient had been my older cousin, Stephanie, who received the watch when she completed her MBA in 2016. She'd been thrilled, remembering Uncle Raymond's stories about the watch, the family history it represented. Stephanie carried it in her purse as a good luck charm, showed it to colleagues, posted photos on social media. 8 weeks after receiving it, she died when her apartment building had a gas leak. The explosion happened at 3:17 a.m. on a Thursday morning. 12 people were injured, but Stephanie was the only fatality, her bedroom positioned directly above where the leak originated. The investigation concluded it was a tragic accident, faulty pipe connections in the building's ancient heating system. Her family received a settlement from the property management company. The watch survived the explosion intact, found in the debris, still showing 3:17. The second recipient was my cousin Trevor, who inherited the watch at his wedding in 2018. He'd been less enthusiastic about it, thought the frozen time was morbid, but he respected Uncle Raymond's wishes and kept the watch in a shadow box in his home office. 6 weeks after his wedding, Trevor drowned while swimming at a friend's lake house. Security footage showed him diving off the dock at 3:17 p.m., hitting his head on something underwater, never surfacing. The autopsy revealed a skull fracture, water in his lungs, accidental drowning. The watch had been in his car, still in its shadow box, untouched by the water. It passed to the next person on Uncle Raymond's list. The third recipient was my Aunt Barbara, Raymond's younger sister, who received the watch on her 60th birthday in 2020. She'd been superstitious about it after Stephanie's and Trevor's deaths, actually called me to express concerns about the pattern. I told her what I believed at the time, that it was horrible coincidence, that correlation wasn't causation, that the watch was just metal and glass with sentimental value. Barbara kept the watch locked in a safe deposit box, refusing to display it or carry it anywhere. It didn't matter. 7 weeks after her birthday, she had a stroke while driving home from her book club. Her car crossed into oncoming traffic, collided with a truck. The accident occurred at exactly 3:17 p.m. The medical examiner determined the stroke had caused the crash, a tragic medical emergency with fatal timing. The watch had been in Barbara's safe deposit box the entire time, untouched, still frozen at 3:17. I'd started to notice the pattern after Barbara died, but I'd rationalized it away. 3 deaths spread over 4 years, each at 3:17 on different days, different months. The statistical probability seemed astronomical, but improbable things happened. Except now Daniel was dead too, the fourth recipient, the fourth death at exactly 3:17. Daniel had inherited the watch 5 weeks ago when he'd been promoted to senior partner at his law firm, one of Uncle Raymond's designated milestones. He'd mentioned to me at a family gathering that he found the whole thing creepy, that he was considering having the watch repaired to erase the morbid association with that frozen time. He'd taken it to 3 different watchmakers, all of whom told him the mechanism was too damaged to fix, that the watch should be preserved as is for its antique value. Daniel had kept it in his desk drawer at work, barely looked at it, until someone found him dead at the bottom of his stairs with the watch clutched in his hand. The detective assigned to Daniel's case was a woman named Lieutenant Kimberly Vance, 22 years with the Metropolitan Police, specializing in accidental death investigations. She met me at the morgue after I'd identified Daniel's body, asked me to walk through his apartment with her to see if I noticed anything unusual. I mentioned the watch immediately, explained the pattern of deaths, the impossible timing coincidence. Vance listened patiently, making notes, but her expression was professionally skeptical. She asked me if I'd recently experienced any significant stressors, if I was sleeping okay, if I'd considered speaking with a therapist about grief. I realized she thought I was spiraling into conspiracy theories because of the trauma of losing multiple family members. She assured me Daniel's death appeared consistent with a tragic accident, likely caused by poor lighting in his stairwell and his habit of checking his phone while walking. I pushed back, asking her to at least review the other 3 deaths, to look at the accident reports and medical findings. Vance agreed to pull the files, more to humor me than because she took the theory seriously. She said she'd contact me if she found anything concerning, but her tone made it clear she expected to find nothing. I left the police station feeling dismissed and frustrated, but also questioning my own judgment. Was I seeing patterns because I needed someone to blame for these deaths? Was grief making me irrational? 4 accidental deaths at the same time seemed impossible, but 4 murders orchestrated to appear accidental while being timed precisely to match a broken watch seemed even more impossible. Who could plan something that elaborate? And why? I started my own investigation that evening, pulling up every document I could find about Uncle Raymond's estate, his will, the beneficiaries, and the order of inheritance for the watch. The will had been drafted by a lawyer named Stanley Roth from Roth & Associates, a small estate planning firm. Raymond had been very specific about the distribution order, creating a numbered list of 23 family members who would receive the watch at various milestones over what he estimated would be 30 to 40 years. The list was arranged by a formula he'd apparently devised based on family birth order, achievements, and his personal preferences. Stephanie had been number 1, Trevor number 2, Barbara number 3, Daniel number 4. I was number 17 on the list, designated to receive the watch when I turned 50, which would be in 8 years. I created a spreadsheet documenting everything about the 4 deaths: dates, times, locations, causes, witnesses, investigating authorities, autopsy findings, insurance claims. I cross-referenced weather conditions, traffic patterns, building safety records, anything that might explain how someone could orchestrate accidents with such precise timing. Stephanie's gas explosion could have been triggered remotely if someone had access to the building's systems. Trevor's drowning could have been staged if someone had placed an obstacle underwater where he was likely to dive. Barbara's stroke could have been induced by certain medications or substances. Daniel's fall could have been caused by something as simple as oil on the stairs or a tripwire. Each individual death had plausible explanations as accidents. But 4 deaths, all at 317, all within weeks of inheriting the same object. That stopped being plausible. The insurance angle nagged at me because of my professional background. I pulled records for all 4 deaths, checking which companies had paid out policies. Stephanie's death triggered a $750,000 life insurance policy, plus the property management settlement of $200,000. Trevor's death paid out $1.2 million from his life insurance, plus additional accidental death benefits. Barbara's policy was smaller, $300,000, but she'd had significant assets that went to her children. Daniel had $2 million in coverage through his law firm, plus his own private policies. In total, the 4 deaths had resulted in approximately $5.8 million in insurance and settlement payouts to various family members. That was motive. Not for killing them individually, but for systematically eliminating people to accelerate inheritance timelines or claim insurance benefits. I started mapping out who benefited financially from each death. The patterns weren't immediately obvious because the victims were from different branches of the family, but I noticed something interesting. Each death accelerated the inheritance schedule for the watch, moving it to the next person on Uncle Lau. Raymond's list faster than he'd predicted. Raymond had estimated the watch would take 35 years to cycle through all 23 recipients. At the current pace, with 4 deaths in 8 years, it would take maybe 15 years total. Someone could be killing recipients to speed up the process, targeting people who were on the list ahead of them, eliminating obstacles to eventually possessing the watch themselves. But why? The watch itself had minimal monetary value, maybe $3,000 as an antique. The real value was sentimental, family legacy, unless the watch contained something valuable that nobody else knew about. I contacted a horologist named Dr. Elliot Gaines, a professor at the State University who specialized in antique timepieces. I explained I had a family heirloom I wanted evaluated and brought him photographs of the watch taken from Daniel's effects. Gaines examined the photos through a magnifying loupe, pointing out details about the watch's construction, its Hamilton, manufacturing date of approximately 1924, and the interesting fact that it appeared to have been opened and resealed at some point. The case back showed tool marks consistent with being pried open by someone who wasn't a professional watchmaker. He asked if I could bring him the actual watch for a more thorough examination. I told him it was currently in police evidence, but I'd see what I could arrange. Lieutenant Vance called me 3 days after our morgue meeting. Her tone was different, less dismissive, more cautious. She said she'd reviewed the files from the previous 3 deaths and had found some interesting inconsistencies. Stephanie's gas explosion investigation had noted trace evidence of accelerant near the leak point, but it had been attributed to cleaning supplies stored nearby. Trevor's drowning had included a witness who claimed to have seen someone else near the dock shortly before Trevor dove in, but that person had never been identified or interviewed. Barbara's stroke had occurred just hours after she'd complained of severe headaches and dizziness to a friend, symptoms that could indicate poisoning rather than natural causes. None of these details had been suspicious in isolation, but together they suggested someone had been staging these accidents. Vance asked me to come to the station to discuss the case officially. We met in an interview room with Vance and her partner, Detective Anthony Rivers, who had 15 years in homicide investigations. They'd contacted the previous investigating agencies, requesting case files and evidence, building a timeline of the 4 deaths. Rivers asked me about family dynamics, who had access to the victims, who might benefit from their deaths. I explained the inheritance structure, the insurance payouts, the watch distribution order. I mentioned that I was number 17 on the list, that if the pattern continued, 16 people would die before the watch reached me. Rivers asked if I'd noticed anyone in the family behaving suspiciously or expressing unusual interest in the watch. I thought about it carefully, reviewing memories of family gatherings, conversations about Uncle Raymond's estate, reactions to the deaths. One name kept surfacing. My cousin Nathaniel, Uncle Raymond's nephew through his brother's side of the family. Nathaniel was number 5 on the watch inheritance list, next in line to receive it according to Raymond's specifications. He was supposed to get the watch when he completed his medical residency, which would happen in approximately 6 months. Nathaniel had been present at all 4 funerals, had expressed particular interest in the watch each time, had even taken photographs of it, claiming he wanted to document family heirlooms. He'd asked me detailed questions about the watch's history, about Uncle Raymond's intentions for its distribution, about whether the inheritance order could be modified. At the time, I'd thought he was just interested in family history. Now, I wondered if he'd been checking on his position in the queue. Vance asked me to provide whatever documentation I had about Nathaniel, his financial situation, his relationship with the deceased family members, his whereabouts during each death. I spent the next week compiling information, using my insurance investigation skills to dig into records that were publicly available. Nathaniel was completing his residency in emergency medicine at County General Hospital, working brutal hours but managing to maintain a high-performance reputation. His financial situation appeared stable, no major debts beyond student loans, living in a modest apartment, driving a 10-year-old Subaru. Nothing suggested obvious financial motive. But I found something else interesting. Nathaniel had been in close geographic proximity to all 4 deaths when they occurred. He'd been visiting Stephanie the weekend of her gas explosion, staying with a friend 2 floors below her. He'd been at the lake house party where Trevor drowned. He'd been having lunch with Barbara the day of her fatal stroke, one of the last people to see her alive. And he'd been at Daniel's office the afternoon before Daniel died, dropping off some documents related to a family trust. The proximity pattern was damning, but still circumstantial. Vance said they needed something more concrete, evidence directly linking Nathaniel to the mechanics of the deaths. They obtained a warrant to examine Daniel's apartment more thoroughly, bringing in forensic specialists who found something the initial investigation had missed. Someone had installed a tiny motion-activated camera in the stairwell, positioned to monitor Daniel's movements. The camera had been removed shortly after his death, but it left behind adhesive residue and a small scratch on the wall that forensic techs could match to specific camera mounting equipment. More importantly, they found traces of a substance on the stairs that matched a commercial lubricant used in mechanical applications. Someone had made those stairs slippery, waited for Daniel to use them at the exact right time. But how would the killer know Daniel would use the stairs at exactly 3:17? That question bothered me until I thought about the watch itself. Daniel had told me he'd been taking the watch to work, keeping it in his desk. What if the watch contained a tracking device? What if someone was monitoring its location, waiting for the right moment to trigger each accident? I shared this theory with Vance, and she immediately requested a warrant to examine the watch from evidence. Dr. Gaines was brought in to open the watch under controlled conditions while forensic techs documented everything. Inside the watch case, hidden beneath the mechanism, they found exactly what I'd suspected. A small GPS tracking device with a cellular transmitter, powered by a thin battery, sophisticated enough to provide real-time location data. The device's serial number led them to a manufacturer, and from there to purchase records showing the device had been bought online 3 months before Uncle Raymond's death. The purchase was made through an anonymous account, but digital forensics traced the payment back to an IP address registered to Nathaniel's apartment building. More importantly, they found subscription records for the tracking service showing continuous monitoring since the device's installation. Nathaniel had been watching the watch's location 24/7 for 8 years, seeing exactly where it was at any given moment, presumably using that information to time his attacks. But they still needed to prove he'd actually committed the murders, needed evidence connecting him to the specific mechanisms of each death. The breakthrough came from Trevor's drowning. Vance contacted the lake house owner, requesting access to their property and permission to search the water where Trevor had died. A dive team found a concrete block with a metal spike welded to the top, positioned exactly where Trevor had hit his head. The block showed weathering consistent with being underwater for years, but analysis of barnacle growth and sediment patterns suggested it had been moved to that specific spot shortly before Trevor's death. More significantly, they found rope fibers attached to the block that matched rope found in Nathaniel's car during a search warrant execution. The rope had been used to position the block precisely, then removed afterward, but microscopic fibers had remained. Stephanie's gas explosion investigation was reopened, and forensic experts found evidence that someone had deliberately damaged the pipe connections, using tools to create weaknesses that would fail under pressure, then timing the failure using a remotely activated valve control that had been installed in the building's mechanical room. The valve controller had been removed after the explosion, but its mounting bracket remained, and they found fingerprints on that bracket. Partial prints, not enough for automatic identification, but enough to compare against known suspects. The prints matched Nathaniel's left index finger and thumb. Barbara's stroke investigation revealed that she'd been poisoned with a rare pharmaceutical compound called tetrodotoxin, a neurotoxin that caused symptoms mimicking stroke in high doses. Nathaniel had access to pharmacy supplies through his hospital work, and security footage showed him entering the pharmaceutical storage area around the time Barbara had lunch with him. Investigators found traces of tetrodotoxin in his apartment, hidden in a locked drawer. The evidence kept mounting. Daniel's stairwell camera was traced back to an order placed using Nathaniel's hospital email account. The lubricant on the stairs was a specialized medical-grade substance used in orthopedic equipment at County General, where Nathaniel worked. Cell phone records showed Nathaniel's phone pinging towers near each victim's location at the time of their deaths. Most damning forensic accountants found that Nathaniel had been managing a complex financial scheme where he'd taken out life insurance policies on the 4 victims, using false documentation to claim insurable interest as a family member who would suffer financial hardship from their deaths. The policies were small, designed to fly under the radar of insurance fraud detection systems, but they totaled approximately $400,000 in payouts that had been funneled to accounts Nathaniel controlled. Vance and Rivers arrested Nathaniel at the hospital where he was finishing his shift. He initially acted confused, claimed he had no idea what they were talking about, suggested there must be some mistake. But when confronted with the physical evidence, the tracking device, the forensic findings, and the financial records, his demeanor changed. He stopped talking, requested a lawyer, but the damage was done. His arrest made local news, and suddenly, family members who'd never questioned the deaths were calling me, asking if I'd really believed the watch was cursed, if I'd suspected Nathaniel all along. I hadn't suspected him, not really, not until the patterns became too obvious to ignore. The prosecutor assigned to the case was Assistant District Attorney Monica Alvarez, a veteran of 38 years who specialized in complex homicides. She met with me multiple times, preparing me for testimony, walking me through the evidence that would be presented at trial. She explained that Nathaniel's motive was a combination of financial gain from the insurance policies and a delusional belief that Uncle Raymond had intended for him to ultimately possess the watch as its rightful heir. Nathaniel had apparently interpreted Raymond's inheritance structure as a test, believing that by eliminating the people ahead of him on the list, he was proving himself worthy of the family legacy. Alvarez described it as a systematic killing spree, dressed up as accidents, one of the most calculated murder schemes she'd prosecuted. The investigation also uncovered that Nathaniel had installed the GPS tracker in the watch years before Uncle Raymond died, breaking into Raymond's house to access the watch, implanting the device, then sealing it back up. He'd been planning these murders for nearly a decade, documenting each victim's routines, identifying vulnerabilities, engineering scenarios that would appear accidental. The frozen time of 317 had been his calling card, his way of creating a pattern that would be noticed eventually but would seem too bizarre to be believed. He'd wanted people to see the connection, to wonder if the watch was cursed, to spread stories about the family heirloom that brought death. It gave him a sense of power, a feeling that he was orchestrating something beyond normal comprehension. The trial lasted 6 weeks. Prosecutors presented overwhelming physical evidence, digital records, financial documentation, and expert testimony from forensic specialists. The defense attempted to argue that the evidence was circumstantial, that Nathaniel's proximity to the deaths was coincidence, that someone else must have planted the tracking device and staged the accidents. But the jury wasn't buying it. The pattern was too clear, the evidence too comprehensive, the timeline too precisely documented. Nathaniel took the stand in his own defense, a risky move that backfired spectacularly. Under cross-examination, he couldn't explain the GPS device in the watch, couldn't account for his presence at all 4 death scenes, couldn't justify the insurance policies or the forensic evidence linking him to the murder weapons. The moment that sealed his conviction came when Alvarez asked him about Uncle Raymond's intentions for the watch distribution. Nathaniel launched into a rambling explanation about how Raymond had secretly wanted him to have the watch, how the numbered list was actually a coded message about proving worthiness, how the frozen time of 317 represented transformation and rebirth. He described feeling chosen, special, destined to fulfill Raymond's true legacy. The The courtroom sat in stunned silence as Nathaniel revealed his delusional thinking, his belief that murder was justified in service of family destiny. Several jurors were visibly disturbed. The defense attorney tried to interrupt, to walk back his client's statements, but the damage was catastrophic. The jury deliberated for 8 hours before returning guilty verdicts on 4 counts of first-degree murder, plus additional charges for fraud, evidence tampering, and illegal surveillance. The judge scheduled sentencing for 4 weeks later, allowing time for victim impact statements and psychological evaluation. During that waiting period, additional details emerged about Nathaniel's psychology. A court-appointed psychiatrist diagnosed him with narcissistic personality disorder and delusional disorder, noting that he'd constructed an elaborate fantasy about being Uncle Raymond's chosen heir, interpreting normal estate planning as secret instructions meant only for him. The psychiatrist testified that Nathaniel had likely been planning these murders since adolescence, when Raymond first showed him the pocket watch and explained its family significance. The sentencing hearing was emotional and brutal. I delivered a victim impact statement describing how Daniel's death had affected me, how the pattern of murders had devastated multiple branches of our family, how Nathaniel had destroyed lives in service of his twisted fantasy. Other family members spoke about Stephanie's vibrant energy extinguished at 28, Trevor's future stolen at 31, Barbara's wisdom silenced at 60. The judge listened to every statement, then turned to Nathaniel and pronounced 4 consecutive life sentences without possibility of parole. She told him he'd shown such callous disregard for human life, such manipulative cruelty, that he deserved to spend the rest of his existence contemplating the magnitude of his crimes. Nathaniel showed no emotion, no remorse, just blank acceptance as bailiffs led him away. The pocket watch was returned to the family after the trial concluded, released from evidence with instructions that it should be destroyed or secured. None of us wanted it. The object itself felt contaminated by what had happened, by the deaths it had enabled, by the tracker hidden in its mechanism. We held a family meeting to decide its fate, and after hours of discussion, we voted unanimously to have it destroyed. Dr. Gaines offered to oversee the process, dismantling the watch, separating the mechanical components, removing the tracking device, and documenting everything for historical record before the pieces were melted down. He explained that the watch itself was innocent, just metal and glass, but that sometimes objects become so associated with trauma that preserving them causes more harm than their historical value justifies. The destruction ceremony happened on a cold morning in November, with 20 family members gathered in Dr. Gaines's laboratory. He carefully disassembled the watch while we watched, explaining each component's function, showing us the craftsmanship that had gone into its original creation. When he removed the GPS tracker, he held it up for everyone to see, this tiny piece of technology that had enabled 8 years of surveillance and 4 calculated murders. Then he separated the watch's components into containers labeled for different recycling processes. The gold and silver would be melted down and repurposed. The glass crystal would be crushed. The tracking device would be incinerated. By the end of the process, nothing remained that could be recognized as Uncle Raymond's watch. The frozen time of 3/17 was finally, definitively, stopped. The insurance companies fought the beneficiary claims at first, arguing that policies obtained through fraud should be voided. But Alvarez had worked with federal prosecutors to ensure the fraud charges were structured so that Nathaniel's victims' estates would still receive death benefits from legitimate policies, while the fraudulent policies he'd taken out would be canceled. Most families received their insurance settlements within a year, though several cases required litigation. My family used portions of our settlements to establish a foundation supporting victims of family violence and domestic homicide, channeling the blood money toward preventing future tragedies. It felt like the only way to find meaning in such senseless loss. The aftermath was complicated for everyone. Some family members blamed Uncle Raymond for creating the inheritance structure that enabled the murders, arguing that his complicated distribution plan had triggered Nathaniel's delusions. Others defended Raymond, saying he couldn't have predicted his nephew's psychopathy, that he'd just been trying to share his treasured heirloom. I fell somewhere in between, believing that Raymond's elaborate will had created conditions that fed Nathaniel's fantasy, but that Nathaniel alone bore responsibility for choosing murder. The debate strained relationships. Some family members stopped speaking to each other. Holiday gatherings became tense and awkward. The murders had killed 4 people directly, but they'd damaged everyone who survived. I struggled with guilt about not recognizing the pattern sooner. 3 people had died before I started suspecting anything, and Daniel might have been saved if I'd been more observant, more willing to trust my instincts, despite how impossible the theory seemed. My therapist, Dr. Helena Vasquez, a trauma specialist with 18 years treating crime victims, helped me process these feelings. She explained that pattern recognition in conspiracy is counterintuitive, that our brains are wired to accept coincidence rather than imagine elaborate murder plots, especially within families where we're conditioned to assume trust and safety. She said my investigation had likely saved 13 lives, the remaining people on Uncle Raymond's inheritance list who would have been targeted as Nathaniel worked his way down to position 1. The case attracted national media attention after the trial concluded, featured on crime documentary shows, analyzed in forensic psychology journals, used as a teaching case in criminal justice programs. I declined most interview requests, not wanting to profit from family tragedy or become known as the cousin of a serial killer. But I did speak to one journalist, a reporter named Crystal Morrison from a major newspaper who'd covered the trial and wanted to write a comprehensive feature about how insurance fraud investigation techniques had helped solve what appeared to be impossible murders. Her article was published 6 months after sentencing, carefully balancing respect for victims, families with detailed analysis of Nathaniel's methodology. The piece earned multiple journalism awards and sparked conversations about insurance industry oversight of policies taken out on family members. 2 years after Nathaniel's conviction, I received a letter from him, forwarded through the prison system. He'd been writing to multiple family members, trying to explain his actions, seeking understanding or forgiveness. I debated whether to read it, whether engaging with his narrative would somehow validate his delusions. Ultimately, I opened the letter, needing to understand his thinking even knowing it would disturb me. The letter was 8 pages of rambling justification, describing how Uncle Raymond had appeared to him in dreams, how the watch had spoken to him about destiny, how the deaths were necessary to fulfill cosmic balance. Nathaniel showed no recognition of reality, no acknowledgement that he'd murdered 4 innocent people for insurance money and a delusional fantasy. I destroyed the letter after reading it once, refusing to preserve his words. Dr. Vasquez said receiving that letter was actually therapeutic in an unexpected way, that seeing Nathaniel's continued delusion helped me release the last threads of doubt about his guilt, any lingering questions about whether he'd somehow been misunderstood or over-prosecuted. He wasn't misunderstood. He was exactly what the evidence showed. A calculated killer who'd spent years planning murders, engineering accidents, and monitoring his victims through illegal surveillance. The letter's bizarre content proved his narcissistic delusion was genuine and profound, not a legal strategy, but a real break from rational thought. That knowledge didn't make the murders less tragic, but it did confirm that stopping him had been absolutely necessary. 5 years after the trial, I visited Daniel's grave on the anniversary of his death. The cemetery was quiet, early morning fog rolling across the manicured lawn. I stood at his headstone, remembering my cousin as he'd been before that pocket watch entered his life, before Nathaniel's paranoid fantasy had targeted him for elimination. Daniel had been a brilliant attorney, a devoted father to 2 daughters, a person who'd approached life with careful ethics and genuine kindness. He'd deserved decades more life, should have watched his daughters grow up, should have built the career he'd worked so hard to establish. Instead, he'd become victim number 4 in a serial killer's delusional quest for a broken watch. I thought about the watch sometimes, about how such a small object had become the center of so much death. The watch itself had been innocent, just machinery and metal, but Nathaniel had transformed it into a weapon through his surveillance technology and his willingness to kill. In some ways, the frozen time of 317 had been prophecy, not because the watch was cursed, but because Nathaniel had made it cursed by building his murder schedule around that specific moment. He'd created the pattern deliberately, engineering accidents to occur at exactly 317 so that eventually someone would notice and wonder if the watch carried supernatural malevolence. It was misdirection, making people look at the object rather than the person manipulating events around it. The family foundation we'd established had grown steadily, now funding domestic violence prevention programs, victim advocacy services, and criminal justice reform initiatives. We'd channeled the insurance settlements into something meaningful, creating resources that might prevent future Nathaniels from hiding their violence behind family structures and manipulating legal systems. The foundation's board included survivors of family violence, law enforcement professionals, and advocates for victims' rights. We held an annual memorial event honoring Stephanie, Trevor, Barbara, and Daniel, keeping their memories alive while working to prevent similar tragedies. It didn't undo what had happened, but it gave purpose to senseless loss. Lieutenant Vance retired from the force after 30 years, and at her retirement party, she told me that the pocket watch case had been the most challenging investigation of her career. She said most murders were straightforward, driven by obvious motives like jealousy or rage, easy to identify once you found the right evidence. But Nathaniel's systematic elimination of family members disguised as accidents required investigative thinking beyond normal parameters, a willingness to consider that someone might be engineering deaths over years according to a predetermined schedule. She credited my insurance investigation background for recognizing the pattern, for pushing past the obvious explanations to find the hidden structure underneath. Her words meant a lot. Validation that my instincts hadn't been paranoid grief, but legitimate pattern recognition. I never inherited Uncle Raymond's watch, obviously. The inheritance schedule stopped at number 4, with the watch destroyed and Nathaniel in prison for life. But I sometimes wondered what would have happened if I'd been earlier on that list, if I'd been number 2 or 3 instead of number 17. Would I have noticed the pattern sooner? Would I have investigated Stephanie's death more carefully? Or would I have been too close to events, too consumed by grief to see the structure hidden behind seemingly random tragedies? I'd never know. The timeline played out exactly as it did, with 4 people dying before the pattern became undeniable, before someone with the right combination of suspicion and investigative access finally connected the deaths. The psychological impact lasted longer than I'd expected. Years after the trial, I'd still catch myself checking the time compulsively around 3:17, morning or afternoon, feeling a spike of anxiety as the clock approached that specific moment. Dr. Vasquez called it trauma association. My Brain had linked that time to danger and death, creating automatic fear responses even when I was perfectly safe. She taught me grounding techniques, ways to interrupt the anxiety spiral, methods for reminding myself that 317 was just numbers on a clock, meaningless except for the meaning Nathaniel had artificially imposed. Gradually, the anxiety faded. Now when I see 317, I think about the investigation, about how persistence and pattern recognition had exposed a killer, about how justice had been achieved even when the crime seemed perfectly hidden. My daughters, now teenagers, know the story in age-appropriate detail. I've explained that someone in our family did terrible things, that he hurt people we loved, that he's in prison forever because of what he did. When they're older, I'll share the full details, the complexity of how Nathaniel engineered the murders, how insurance fraud and GPS tracking had enabled his crimes, how recognizing the pattern had saved lives. They deserve to understand that families can harbor darkness, that trust must be balanced with awareness, that questioning suspicious patterns isn't paranoia, but wisdom. The lessons from this tragedy are too important to hide behind protective silence. The last time I thought about Uncle Raymond himself was last month, when I found an old photo album at my parents' house showing Raymond as a young man, standing proudly in his jewelry shop, the pocket watch visible in his vest pocket, even in the 1960s black and white photograph. He'd carried that watch for decades, treasured it as a connection to his grandfather, probably never imagining it would become the centerpiece of a murder conspiracy. I wondered what Raymond would have thought about Nathaniel's crimes, whether he would have felt responsible for creating the inheritance structure that enabled them. I hoped he would have felt horror and regret, though I'd never know. Raymond had been gone years before the murders started, unable to witness how his elaborate will had fed his nephew's delusions. The watch's destruction had felt necessary and right at the time, but sometimes I wished we'd preserved some piece of it. Maybe just the crystal or one gear, something to remember the family history that predated Nathaniel's violence. Dr. Gaines had photographed the watch extensively during the destruction process, creating a digital archive that documented its construction and components. The photographs lived in a secure server, accessible to family members who wanted to remember the watch as it was before it became a murder weapon. I'd looked at those photos exactly once, seeing the intricate gearing, the elegant design, the craftsmanship of 1920s American watchmaking. Then I'd closed the folder and hadn't opened it again. Some histories were better left documented but not dwelled upon. The family slowly healed, or at least learned to function with our wounds. Holiday gatherings remained smaller and more somber than before, the absence of 4 people, leaving permanent gaps in our celebrations. But we found ways to honor them, to keep their memories present without being consumed by grief. Stephanie's MBA scholarship fund supported business students from underrepresented backgrounds. Trevor's Lake House friends established a water safety foundation, teaching swimming and rescue techniques. Barbara's book club created a library endowment in her name. Daniel's law firm instituted an ethics award for young attorneys committed to justice over profit. These memorials felt better than the alternative, better than just remembering them as victims of a serial killer's delusion. Nathaniel remains in prison, serving his consecutive life sentences in a maximum security facility. I don't follow his case closely anymore, don't need to know about his parole hearings that will never result in release, or his attempts to appeal convictions that were supported by overwhelming evidence. He exists in a space separate from my life now, relevant only as the person who committed crimes that were solved and punished. The obsession that consumed me during the investigation, the need to understand every detail of how he'd engineered the murders, has faded into simple acknowledgement that evil exists, that some people choose to harm others in service of delusional beliefs, and that justice sometimes works even when crimes are perfectly disguised. If you made it this far, you understand that pattern recognition saves lives, that questioning impossible coincidences isn't paranoia, but survival instinct, that objects can be weaponized by people who see them as tools rather than symbols. The pocket watch didn't kill anyone. Nathaniel killed 4 people and used the watch as a targeting mechanism, a way to track his victims and time his attacks. The distinction matters because blaming objects for human evil is how we avoid confronting uncomfortable truths about what people are capable of when their delusions go unchallenged. Hit that like button if you believe justice should always pursue truth, no matter how impossible the pattern seems. Thanks for watching till the end. Make sure to subscribe and like to not miss the next story.